Thank you all for being here for the Northwest Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network's first webinar of 2025. I'm going to go ahead and get rolling because it is 11, but if you're trickling in and you miss anything, and to all of you, no worries, there'll be a recording sent out after this as well. A little bit about who I am. I'm Eva Colberg. I'm a research scientist for the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, and I'm also coordinator of the Northwest RISC. So today I'll be serving two roles, both facilitating today's event and also speaking as the first of two talks in this webinar. I'll start us off with my lessons from work that I did in the Northeast on climate smart invasive species management, and then to bring that really home here to the Northwest, where we're now based, where I'm now based. It's my immense privilege to be able to share the stage today with Ray Willard, State Roadside Asset Manager with Washington State Department of Transportation, who will really ground us with lessons from his extensive career and talk about preserving and restoring native ecosystems in a changing climate. If you want any additional information about Ray or myself or today's webinar, I'm going to go ahead and put a link in the chat, but I'll go ahead and delve into some housekeeping and then we can get started. So just to start with, if you didn't hear, we are recording this webinar. That means that you'll be able to access it afterwards. We'll send that out to all who registered ahead of time, but this will also be available on our website and the Northwest RISC YouTube. If you're ever interested in seeing other webinars that we've done in the past, those are also available online. I encourage you to go check those out. And then in terms of how, if you're here live, you can interact with us today, a couple of options. We do encourage you to ask questions. There'll be time after both talks where you can potentially see some of your questions answered live. And if we don't get to everything, we'll try and get to some of those post-facto as well and send that out afterwards. But there also is the option to respond with reactions via the webinar function. And so do you all have these options for reactions? Oh no, Darcy, do we see these?
They should be. Yep, there we go. Okay, do you see?
Oh, I do. Hooray. Okay. So thank you. I'm looking at the wrong screen for that. But if you don't like seeing those reactions from other people, sorry. If you can check the little caret next to that reaction button to hide or to minimize those reactions as well for your own view only. And it looks like some of you already know where that reaction button is, but just to get us started, if you can go ahead and find those claps, if you're at all concerned about the impacts of climate change on invasive species management. And I feel like this is a loaded question because if you're here in this webinar, you probably are concerned. And we also know that a lot of people in the RISC network, in the Northwest RISC in particular, are very concerned, or at least somewhat concerned about these impacts. And so in large part, that's also a big focus of what we do with the Northwest RISC is what those impacts are and how can we deal with them? How can we address these impacts of climate change and invasive species? But more broadly, the Northwest RISC network is a partnership of regional agencies and organizations that are aiming again to address those impacts and help us better understand them as well, focused on Oregon, Idaho, Washington, BC, and neighboring states and provinces. We're also pretty broad in terms of which taxonomic groups we're focused on, plants, animals, pathogens, and more. Anything that's potentially invasive in this area is of interest to us as a whole. And so if you're interested in that general topic, if you're concerned about climate change and invasive species, I do encourage you to participate in Northwest RISC. And in part, this is because we've been on a little bit of a hiatus for a lot of the past year. The ways that you can really get involved are just first and foremost, staying in touch with what is happening with us. We do keep our website updated, and if you subscribe to our listserv, you'll see events, etc., as they go as well. But also, if you are in the research sphere and you yourself publish something or know your colleagues have published relevant research that you might want to share with the group or have us share with the group, please let us know. Likewise, if you're in management and you just come across something that was helpful to your work and you think others might benefit from that as well, I would really like to see this become a little bit more of a more frequently sharing resources that are helpful for us. And that goes for management stories as well. And I think today's talk in particular is going to be really centered on bringing to light different lessons learned in management. But I think it's really important to have both sides of that, what the on-the-ground realities are and what the research is able to deduce as well. And if you're interested in all of that and want even more, we do have space on our advisory team, and I encourage you to reach out to see what that might involve, to see if maybe that's a good fit for you as well. I'll also mention that the Northwest risk is not the only risk out there. In fact, there are others, other regions. Canada has a national invasive species and climate change network as well. And I'll highlight the Northeast risk in particular because that's where a lot of my talk today is going to be focused on, just because, again, these are lessons that I've learned from the Northeast. And so with that, I'll actually get started with the content that I have for you today. And so this work is largely going to be based off of what I did in the Northeast, where I was working with the New York Invasive Species Research Institute and Cornell University, and funded by the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center to really identify lessons in climate-smart invasive species management with managers and decision makers in the Northeast. But because I'm now here in the Northwest with you all, I do want to have that lens as well. And I think there are a lot of really broadly applicable lessons that we've learned, as well as just general similarities between our two regions. So my goals for today, talking to you, are to categorize some of the challenges that climate change and invasive species pose to management. And these are pretty broad, but I'd like to drive those home then with examples of what those challenges look like for managers in the Northeast and how they're dealing with those via climate-smart invasive species management. But again, really thinking about how then that applies to the Northwest, I think, again, there are a lot of really broadly applicable lessons. And I want to encourage you all to think about in your own context what that might look like for you, what that does look like for you, if you're doing things similarly, if things seem like they might be radically different for you. And I'd really be curious in hearing about that as well. And there'll be some options for you to put in that information as well. So just to get started, I want to show you this figure and then I'm going to put a little bit of text above it, but we'll go through step by step. This is showing just some broad ways in which climate change and invasive species interact. And then those interactions have implications for management plans, actions, and outcomes. And so if you're interested in finding a little bit more about these different broad interactions, we do have a research summary out that goes into the article that this figure is from. But I'm also going to go through these in quick succession as well. First and foremost, we know that climate change is impacting where invasive species can exist and persist and occur. And you can tell that this was a figure drawn when I was in the Northeast. But we also know that there are species in the Northwest where this is also true, particularly thinking about northward range shifts being or going higher up in altitude range shifts. And the implications of all of these are that there are new species to evaluate, monitor, and target. I do want to mention in particular that from a Northwest perspective, there's less information on what those specific range shifts might be, which species those are really applicable to. And I just want to highlight that as an option for potential research and thinking as well. But where invasive species are coming from can also be from much farther afield. So thinking about trade and transport and thinking about how climate change might impact that. whether that's directly through opening up new trade routes from melting sea ice, or also thinking about what things are actually in trade and more frequently in trade, with more frequently having matches with where they're coming from versus where they're going to, and how climate change can impact all of that. Can end up ultimately increasing and creating new pathways for introductions that then, from a management standpoint, might be important to think about monitoring and regulating, or just being aware of if your site is close to some of those hotspots for that might be in contact with as well. We also know that the timing of when invasive species are active, reproducing, when you might want to manage them, um, can be impacted both by broad patterns of climate change as well as one-off events that are driven by or exacerbated by climate change. And so if you work with invasive species, you know that phenology is pretty important for timelines, and seasonality is also important for timelines of when you can go out in the field, when you can observe and see those species, and when you can do specific treatments. But thinking about feasibility as well, there are aspects of how climate change can just impact the conditions that you might be able to do your work, yes, but it can also impact the direct efficacy of different treatments, whether that's altering how chemicals are being uptaken or altering how, the speed at which a plant is growing after you've cut it. And so thinking about that impacting the likelihood of actually achieving your desired results, and management might be another way that climate change is creating additional wrenches in your plans. Thinking about the vulnerability of native ecosystems in a changing climate, invasive species can be an additional stressor or can compound that stress. So things like emerald ash borer in an already drought-stressed forest might be one example. Um, and ultimately thinking about how then increased vulnerability might shift what your restoration targets are if you think that it's not very likely that the species that you used to prioritize will continue to be able to exist and persist and thrive. And maybe shifting compositions in what you are looking at, or just maybe increasing the efforts that you have if you think that it's worth that. So creating these different cases for having different value judgments come into play as well. And finally, I do want to mention that extreme climatic events in particular can also interact with invasive species in particular ways that I think can ultimately require a better integration of how we're thinking about extreme event preparedness and invasive species management, whether that's thinking about how invasive grasses can increase the impacts and likelihood of potential fire events and how climate change can play a role within that, or thinking about, as the picture illustrates, how different potential grass species like Phragmites might, or how different species might impact the ability of an ecosystem to withstand flood, to attenuate, to provide some sort of ecosystem service in extreme climatic events as well. And so, given these broad interactions, I'm curious, and I'll have a poll for you all that I'm going to put live so that you can just put your own input in terms of what you think makes the most sense for where you're seeing these interactions in your own work. I'm going to give us a little moment for you to read through and put your own options in there. Looks like upwards of 65% of you have responded. I'm going to give a little bit more time. Okay, and if you're taking a lengthy time to write your response, do beware that I'm about to end the poll if you didn't get a chance to respond in full. We do have a chat available if you're comfortable with that, or you can DM me if you just want me to know. Ending the poll now. So it looks like a lot of you are really interested and feel like increased vulnerability of native ecosystems is very relevant for your work. But frankly, all of those options have some level of relevance as well. And then when it comes to how you all are incorporating climate change into your invasive species management work, I want you to keep that in mind. And we're going to change into the next part of my talk where we start thinking about what other folks are doing with invasive species management as well. So thanks all for that input. Okay. So going back to the idea that we're seeing our management plans, action, and outcomes being impacted by climate change, what can we do about those impacts? You know somewhat what you're doing about those impacts or what you might wish you were doing. But this is where I have the privilege of sharing knowledge from, again, other people about climate smart invasive species management in the Northeast. And I do want to just define that term because it might not be intuitive. In my work and the work of the RISCs, we're thinking about actions that are considering and really aiming to address the interactive effects of climate change and invasive species as climate smart invasive species management. And so that might be invasive species management that's bringing in a climate change lens and having that filter your decisions a little bit. But that might also be general restoration work that's, again, thinking about how invasive species and climate change might be jointly compounding and impacting your work. Or that might be something completely different, something climate focused, where you are thinking about invasive species as well. But the information that I'll be drawing from for this next section is coming from 24 different interviews with invasive species practitioners and decision makers in the Northeast, mainly US, but a little bit of Canada as well. And these were folks coming from different types of organizations, from governmental to private nonprofit. There was a little bit of a plant bias, but also looking at invertebrates and other types of taxonomic groups as well. And there was a mix of managers looking at solely terrestrial or terrestrial plus aquatic, and in a couple cases, solely aquatic environments as well. And before I delve into the variety within these, what folks were saying in these interviews, I want to start with just one particular example that I actually got to go out and visit the site of. This is a site in New Hampshire where the manager is really prioritizing prevention and thinking of it as addressing a gateway site for invasions. And so you can see this lovely little wetland area that's below an upland forest. This is the site that the manager really wanted to keep as their priority in terms of preventing invasions from coming in because there weren't a whole lot of invasive species there at the moment. With the big exception being they had a lot of ash trees, and emerald ash borer is a reality in that area. We also know emerald ash borer is in the Northwest as well, although we're a little bit further ahead of the invasion curve in a lot of places here still. And so if you're interested in emerald ash borer in particular and how that might be relevant for your own work, we do have some resources on that available through Northwest RISC. I'll also put a link to our management brief on emerald ash borer in particular. But in this particular example, again, that was just one part of the big puzzle. So they were aware that they would probably be losing a lot of ash trees due to emerald ash borer, thinking about all the canopy gaps that would be cropping up in their priority site. And then thinking about the fact that across the road, they had this other site that was next to a bottomland riparian floodplain area that also had a lot of agriculture going on. And so both of those things making this more of a gateway site where invasive species from the floodplain and from the agriculture could come in. Thinking about how those species then might be able to just cross the road and get into that wetland site, get into canopy gaps as they start emerging. And so the approach the manager was taking here and how they were framing climate change in their work are a couple different ways. They're really starting to rethink their priorities, and this is also where they had partnerships help with that. So they were able to conduct vulnerability assessments with research partners that were able to say, okay, based on climate change, which species of canopy trees will be most likely in different parts of their sites. And they were using that to help inform their future planning, which decisions might be better for those future trees, rather than thinking about the current trees, which, if they're ash, we're going to be dying as well. But they were also thinking about this from a multiple stressor lens, recognizing that there would be other climate stresses coming into their site as well, but those might be harder to address for them. And so invasive species, from their perspective, were the much more actionable problem in a lot of their management decision making. And so they're prioritizing that and just having that be, again, when their decisions coming down to it, they're aware of the impacts of climate change, but they're also aware of where their own limitations were. And a big part of their philosophy was also to learn by doing. So they were taking note of which treatments were working in their context and really adapting that. You can see a little bit in the picture in the bottom left, where there's a little bit of an area that seems like there's a little less green. That's just where they're spot testing a different treatment to see, was it working on their target species in that particular site. And they did a lot of that, just seeing before we go out at full scale what is actually different from what we know about the label and the research and our own individual conditions here. And I think that particular example already highlights a couple different themes that emerged in these interview results. So rethinking priorities, leveraging partnerships, managing multiple stressors, and learning by doing. These were actions or ways of thinking that other interviewees were also mentioning and practicing. But I am also going to highlight some of the other approaches that people took. And so those will include embracing flexibility, taking proactive approaches, recognizing the power of framing, and valuing knowledge. But I want to couch that by also recognizing that there are different challenges that folks are facing. And one that was particularly interesting from us on the research standpoint was the fact that we knew that there were studies that showed potential cases where reduced efficacy might be of concern for invasive species management in a changing climate. But what immediately started coming out in the interviews was that managers were thinking much more often about just the conditions of work and are they able to even go out and work? Are they able to, send folks out? Is it too hot? Is it flooded? And are they going to have to change everything in response to those changing conditions? And so different aspects of how my interviewees were thinking about the feasibility of their invasive species management in a changing climate were how that might impact spray and chemical dilution runoff with rain events or wind, thinking about just treatment windows and site access. Again, can you go out and do the work that you want to do at the time you had it for your permit at the time that you just had it in your schedule. And thinking about particularly for folks who have more vulnerable volunteer populations, health and safety concerns for your outdoor workers, if it's super hot, if it's super smoky, just thinking about the ways that that can directly impact abilities to do work. But also thinking about, again, external barriers. So funding and policy, I think, is almost universally a complication and a consideration that can produce logistical challenges with management. But thinking about how flexibility is so important in a changing climate, that can become additional friction with existing policy timelines, existing funding timelines as well. But even within those boundaries, folks were still thinking about how they could increase their flexibility and how they could practice learning by doing or adaptive management. And I want to highlight too that some of these stories are things that people are aware of being interesting, being potentially useful, that they're talking about to their colleagues, but um, there aren't always outlets for really sharing that information. And so I think that was partly also just the people I talked to were really excited to talk to me because it felt like that was a way they could share what they were doing. But some of the practical solutions that they had from a flexibility standpoint, we're thinking about their timelines, being more flexible, but specifically that could be things like scheduling volunteer trainings earlier in the season, just knowing that they might need to start having their volunteers doing that particular task earlier in the season as well. Thinking about adaptive management and how that could work in their own cases and taking in that experimental lens of, okay, we're going to try out this one treatment here and see how it goes. And we know it won't be the same as, what would be published in a peer-reviewed journal necessarily, but can that still inform what we're doing? And from that lens, also thinking about when they might need to increase the frequency or combine different treatments of if it's not working, what can we do to add on? Well, but I think a key part for all of that was that when they were able to be most flexible was often when they had external support, where they had research partnerships that were able to help facilitate more rigorous experimentation, or just inform them and be that experimental lens, or where they had partners with school groups that were able to come out and provide extra force, extra hands on the ground, extra just enthusiasm as well, and potentially partner on funding opportunities from that as well. I do want to mention proactive steps that folks are taking as well. And so thinking about species moving north, they would mention that they just talked to their southern neighbors about which species they were dealing with. Um, the Northeast RISC does have more materials available. Specifically, there are watch lists and priority framing documents, and then there are actual watch lists as well available in different parts of that region that folks would mention, but also just prioritizing early detection and rapid response and recognizing that that is a really powerful tool for being proactive, for being able to, if there is a species moving in, whether or not climate change is impacting its shift, seeing early detection and rapid response is a way to be able to be proactive about that new species. And I will also couch that with just saying that we still know that even if folks are excited about what they can do to be proactive and they're mentioning that, oh, we're being proactive in such and such way, overall, from surveys that we've done with the Northeast RISC network, folks are still overall spending more time managing current rather than emerging invasions. And that makes sense too, I think, just based on what you see out there as well. But framing also played a part, and I think this is something that different organizations had more or less leeway with, where they were able to really incorporate climate change in their strategic plans or when they're renewing strategic plans, and just explicitly mentioning climate change could make a difference with whether or not they felt able to act upon that in their own decision-making. From an outreach perspective as well, folks had mentioned that they were thinking about climate change there and mentioning it to their, whatever their outreach materials included. And social marketing was something that came up in a couple cases to think about how issues about climate change and invasive species could be reframed to better encourage public cooperation or partnerships as well. And I'll finally end with folks here again, we're excited about learning as well. Not just sharing their information, but learning more and thinking about how knowledge can inform their own management. And I just want to highlight that because I think that learning-based framework can be really important for knowing that we're going to have to adapt. How can knowledge help us adapt? With that being said, I'm going to finish up with just a few thoughts on how to apply these lessons in the Northwest. And I think with the poll, you were able to submit what you are doing yourself about climate smart invasive species management. Rather than go through all of the responses, for that, I want you to think about your own response, and I'm going to mention just a few responses that have come up in a past survey of the Northwest RISCC network. People have mentioned things like they're monitoring stream temperatures for potential changes and considering that when they're also thinking about the distributions of their native and non-native species. In some cases, folks mentioned collecting seed from various locations and aiming for high diversity and planting with the mindset that that might increase resilience to invasions and to climate change. We've seen folks submit examples of revegetating disturbed sites and using climate models to determine which species and which configurations will best survive in those areas as well. And another example would be modeling in order to just better time when they're surveying and eradicating different species as well. And so there's a lot of wealth in different knowledge forms. One of the things we did with the knowledge in the Northeast was turn some of that into a set of guidelines for climate smart invasive species management. And so again, recognizing that there are these barriers of time, money, knowledge, and also different additional policy hurdles and regulatory frameworks that can make it hard to be flexible. We were able to get manager input in what those hurdles might be and what different actions might be able to alleviate those hurdles. And so I'm going to provide you with a little bit of insight to just what that final document was in terms of we did have mentions of where folks were raising policy options that might help them with their own work. But the overall guidelines that we developed from that process, although again, they're focused on the Northeast, I think do have a lot of those broad lessons in terms of what you might be able to do to better incorporate climate change into your own work. And so I do want to mention that these are not super prescriptive and they're not site specific at all, but they're just a starting point of the assortment of options to choose from and where support might be useful. And I think there might be a lot here that can be really easily translatable to the Northwest as well. I'm going to take a little bit of time for questions here, but if you want to learn more about any of what I talked to, a lot of that information is available on the Northwest RISCC website. I also do want to mention again that if you have examples of climate smart invasive species management in the Northwest, please let me know. Yes. Northwest RISCC is the website. And I'm actually gonna, since we're running a little bit behind on time, I'm going to introduce Ray Willard, and if there are any questions that do come in the chat, I'll maybe take one or two. But I'm gonna stop sharing my screen in the meantime so that we can get Ray ready to go. And I'll also just say that Ray, again, is a state roadside asset manager for the Washington State Department of Transportation. He holds a Bachelor of Landscape Architecture from the University of Washington and has been practicing as a licensed landscape architect in Washington State since 1990. So for the past 30 years, Ray has worked on directing and developing the Washington State DOT's statewide roadside vegetation management program and training maintenance crews in the practice of integrated vegetation management. He's a past president and honorary member of Washington State Vegetation Management Association. And if you want to learn more about Ray, again, we do have that information on our website. I'm not seeing any questions right now, so I'm going to turn things over to you, Ray, and I'll turn off my camera and turn the floor over.
Thanks, Eva. Yeah, hi, everybody. Am I coming through okay, audio?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, so that was great. I think I had so much going through my mind as far as how I should follow up on that, Eva, but I think that really was a great sort of baseline that we can talk from. And what I'm going to be talking about is really as a landscape architect. So that's been my lens from way back, even before I went to school. I was always kind of looking at the way we've developed the land in this country, and really questioning a lot of things as far as what what we're doing here. Is it the right thing to do as far as building stuff on the land? So really thinking about this as landscape architecture, a couple of thoughts specific to what Ev was talking about is the framing, and then the scale at which you find solutions, so and apply solutions. So really, invasive species is one frame that can be applied, and it's interesting that people get kind of fascinated and stuck on invasive species management. In terms of landscape architecture, what we're really talking about is managing the entire system, the entire landscape, and everything that goes on in that. So not just the invasives, but all of the other species. And if you want to talk invasives, Europeans are probably some of the worst invasive species on the planet as far as damage to the natural ecosystems around the globe. So that said, really what I'd like to talk about here is the scales that I've been thinking about and working on in terms of finding solutions to climate change and adapting our basically looking at sustainable development and urban ecology as places that we can apply solutions to help us build a more sustainable society. And so the other thing that I always like to remind people as we start talking about that is that really we're talking about the three pillars of sustainability, which are society, environment, and economy. And so sustainability, or the most sustainable solutions, are solutions that help balance those three pillars and make sure that it's all kind of working together. And that's the best solution really long term. So looking forward, how do we apply that? What I've been doing here at DOT is really looking at it from the lens of a state transportation system in Washington, which is 7,000 miles long and has 100,000 acres of land along that road system that need to be managed. So I'll talk about that, but then really what I'm also working on right now in terms of my volunteer time is here in Olympia, where I live, we are taking out the dam that has formed Capitol Lake for the last 70 years. And that dam coming out is going to restore about 2 miles of estuary system here in the Olympia Tumwater area and create an incredible, basically a laboratory for us to study how to restore native systems, natural systems in an urban setting. And then really the frame or the landscape scale that we're talking about here is watershed. So the Deschutes watershed, and really looking at what you can do to manage the land at the watershed scale. That's really, as far as I've come to see, the key scale that should be leveraged as far as community engagement, basically just creating motivation from the people who live in the watershed to go out and take action to help protect and preserve it. But I won't talk as much about that, but I think that's just an important thing to make sure everybody is kind of thinking along those lines about scale and framing. All right, so really, as far as as far as the roadside go, what we've been doing here is trying to get the word out that the roadsides and their highway systems are really some of the most either potentially beneficial or creating a huge liability to the rest of the landscape as far as building and maintaining highways. Cities, is a whole nother thing, but really the highway system, because it goes across all the landscape, you're exposing all of that landscape to the threats of invasive species, fire, just having that many cars, that the pollution that comes off of that system is really unsustainable. So the only way to get back at that, or to find a solution for that, really, in my mind, is to spend more on designing and maintaining roadsides that can be more resilient in terms of climate and in terms of invasive species and in terms of fire, not to mention traffic and traffic safety, and then all of the stormwater that comes off of that. So really what we're talking about here is creating what we'd like to do is create a very robust and well-managed natural system along that whole 7,000 miles of highway that we maintain, and then have that be an example of how highways can be maintained at the county level, city streets, and then up to the national highway system. And then really, as a global issue, this is something that needs to be looked at closely. So the problem is there's not enough money, really, and not enough resources to do what we need to do here. And in terms of transportation in our state right now, we're really fallen behind on keeping up with the amount of traffic, and then building new systems. And then we've been really working on fish passage, which is a great thing, but that's really taking a lot of the resources that are needed to maintain and sustain the systems that we've already built. So that's a problem. And then the other thing that's going on here is another thing I want to point out that's critical here is climate change goes hand in hand with population growth and increased development of the landscape. And that in itself accelerates the whole process. So you're not just talking about the climate change that's resulting from carbon in the atmosphere and any of the things that go along with that. But what we're talking about is more people, especially in the Northwest, coming to live here. And the term climate refugees, I saw one of the comments in there, Steve Erickson, and Steve, if that's you, the Steve Erickson that I know, hello. But you're right. I mean, that's really what we're talking about here is climate refugees coming here and bringing their own values with them. And what we're saying here in the Northwest is we really need to have kind of this culture of sustainability and ecosystem preservation and caring for our home. And we can't really expect to do that if we've got a bunch of people moving here that really just want to bring their old place with them and start over. And that's just not going to work. So we're looking at a real challenge ahead in terms of those things. And I'll talk more about the wildfire issue in Eastern Washington with some examples later. But particularly in the last 5 years, but even before that, we've been kind of on a slow decline in terms of resources and the ability to keep up with all this. So that's kind of the message that we've got there is we need to spend more on roadside. Okay, so given all that, and what I'll talk about is kind of give you a real quick overview of what we're doing to come up with a system to monitor and plan for, and then record the story of all of that activity that goes on around managing roadsides in Washington State. But we've got a great system. I've had the opportunity to work on this for almost 35 years now to build what we've got here, and a really great team of folks around the state that have come to like pick this up as a something they can really do to make a difference. And so we've got a really good attitude within WashDOT as far as the crews go in terms of getting that, getting out there and getting after this in the best way possible. So that said, really what we're talking to the legislature about and all the rest of the state agencies about is we need to spend more and get more resources devoted to the care and management of our state's roadsides as some of our most critical public lands. All right, so I'll talk more about, got the drone in there, I'll tell you about that a little bit. But really what I wanted to show you first is the system that we've built to record and tell the story of the evolving condition and management of our roadsides in Washington State. So here's the kind of go-to summary of all of the work we've done so far, and that's really trying to build a map of our system using GIS, and then have that map be part of a portable mobile data system that the folks that are taking care of this system can go take with them out into the field and use that as a recording device to reference what the planned actions are, and then to record what their actual actions are in a daily set of records. So that's really key in any system that you're going to manage, is having a solid storyline that's being recorded as you go. And really that's going to be the key to any kind of landscape management, or if you want to be able to look at what is really sustainable in terms of development and land management. So we got to spend some time as a group thinking about this as an agency. We were required by federal highways to develop an asset management account for our bridges and pavements. And what we did here at WashDOT, and one of the only states to do that, was to take that same lens of how much there is, what condition it's in, how much it's costing to maintain, and all of that, and put it on the roadsides as well. So that was a huge help. And what we were able to do with that is show what it would take to actually get back on top of our roadsides, because we've got an increasing backlog every year, more weeds, more overgrown vegetation that we can't get to, that we're just kind of keeping up with. So go back all the way to when I first started working on this. We were doing an environmental impact statement. We spent a lot of time and energy on this to really look at, and it really was a lot of it centered on pesticide use, or herbicides is really what we use mostly here at WashDOT. So coming out of that, the preferred alternative was to use integrated pest management principles as a basis for decision making in terms of vegetation on the roadside. And so we worked with EPA and a consultant on sustainable or biointegral solutions, and we were able to come up with a sort of a model for how we could do this here on our roadsides in Washington. And then at the same time, as an agency, we're working on our construction and design standards to make sure that whatever we did come up with in terms of project development was going to be something that could be productive and sustainable throughout its life cycle. So highway systems, usually, 50 years, 75, you'd hope, but a lot of times it's not even that long before the highway gets rebuilt and redone and everything gets restarted. But what we were able to do as a result of all that early work was create a system for planning. And so for the plans, now we have a set of 24 area management plans that are all maintained with an annual discussion of work and looking at all the data that's come in the past years and trying to make better decisions moving forward. Those plans are all available online. The website that I had there, if you look at WashDOT and then just search for vegetation maintenance, you'll see all of those plans and all the information we have on there as far as our risk assessment on pesticide use and then how we're basically recording this. So this is the system that we've come to as far as recording and planning the work, and then also evaluating the condition annually to see the trends. And the trends on weeds are not good, because we've been watching it now for almost 20 years and mapping it using this system. And what it shows is that we are kind of on getting close to the edge of the waterfall as far as falling off on that. So it's really critical that we get on top of this and quick. So this is the annual process that we go through to kind of work with the crews, train the crews, make sure that they have reference when they go out and do the work, and then record that work. So the outer circle is the data recording, which is mostly just keeping the records coming in throughout the growing season. And then where we're at right now, I'm just about to start on my rounds, and I'll go to all 24 maintenance areas, sit down with each crew and help them plan out their work and look at all of the data that we have from previous years. So this is the other thing that's really exciting for me, because we just kind of came up with this in the last couple years as a new recording tool or reporting tool. And we've got now, going back to 2017 is when we started implementing a new system we call HATS, which is the Highway Activity Tracking System. And we're using mobile devices, iPads, that have a set of forms on them that record all of our work for maintenance. But in terms of roadside vegetation, we're recording weed control, site restoration efforts, control of safety related issues, vegetation obstructions, trees mainly, and then looking at also any of the areas that are formally landscaped would be the purple line there. And then reporting back to all of the dollars and acres of work that were recorded each year, going back almost, well, getting close to 10 years. But really, you can see the trends. The costs have gone up. Our acres, kind of have also followed that as far as productivity. But the fact is, even though our expenditures are going up, that is not keeping up with inflation and the amount of increased work we've had from new freeways and new construction. Whoops. Here's the other part of this is really this using Power BI. So you might have noticed that this is the way we can basically have a system that all of the folks that are working on this can access, and they can see in their area what the plan is, how much area they have to deal with, and then on the other tab of accomplishments, they can see what their actual records have shown in recent years. All right, so let's go really quick through the rest of this. I wanted to talk a little bit about innovation. I mean, that's really the way we've been able to stay ahead of this as much as we have, or keep from falling behind more, is applying things like drone technology for treating in areas that we couldn't get to before. I think the other thing that the system that I just showed you has as an advantage is we can really zero in on the places that matter most. So prioritized treatment of the most serious infestations that we have of invasive species throughout our system. So being able to map those and then have a treatment plan that looks at what it would take over the next few years to actually eradicate or manage that site so that those invasive species are addressed. But using this kind of technology, this is just expanding our abilities without increasing our costs a lot. But we're currently studying this. I'll have more information on it in the coming years. But this is the drone that we were able to buy for our own crews to use. We're also contracting with some other folks to do larger scale treatments with using aerial drone application, which is really a game changer for agriculture and for roadside management. So the first place that we're really looking at this, and I'll kind of use this as an illustration for how hard it is to build a new freeway without really trashing the landscape that surrounds that freeway. But this is Walla Walla. This is down in the southeast corner of the state. This is US 212, which is coming into Walla Walla here. Looking at the distance, Walla Walla is about 7 miles away on the horizon there. And we have 7 miles, 300 acres, and that's been in place and being maintained now since 2008. We also have, if you look the other way, a new part of this, and this is kind of, I call it the wine expressway, because it really is trying to get folks in and out of Walla Walla without having to. You can see the old alignment there takes you through Loudon and Touchy, where there's a bunch of wineries and people pulling off and tasting wine and then getting back on the road. So we've now got a bypass for that. But this is really a challenging system to look at, because you can see what we're doing is just ripping through all that agricultural land and creating a weed garden. I mean, this, and this is really difficult to get the right plants up and growing. There's so many invasives, and really we're talking about over here, the primary is a cereal rye, and you can see a little bit of that popping through there on the would be the left side of the image in the median, and then cheatgrass is downy brome, and that's the other thing over on the east side that just sort of dominates the site quickly. And then the other thing that's in there is Russian thistle and kochia, but mainly Russian thistle, the tumbleweeds, classic tumbleweeds. So it's been real challenging. We didn't do a great job managing the contract that seeded this and then is maintaining it for the first 3 years. And so when maintenance gets us back after 3 years after construction, we're going to have a lot of weed control to do. So what we're trying to do is, and here's the older section. This is what it looks like after 8 years, 2008. So, we're looking at 15 years of growth and management. The taller big basin wild rye is a perennial grass, and you can see some of the blue bunch wheatgrass is the shorter perennial species. But a lot of the other lower growing stuff you see in there is cheatgrass. And then there's some cereal rye in places that is actually on this stretch, we've got it up to like 6 or 7 feet tall. It's crazy. Feral rye is another word for that. So that site is being treated. We've got a contractor that's going to be treating that, finishing up the treatment as soon as we can get our crews off winter shift, because we do have to provide traffic control. And so that will get treated here about mid-March. And we'll finish treating the rest of that 300 acres. And we're using a soft pre-emergent, some of the new chemicals that have come online. Supposedly, what the vendors or manufacturers are telling us can suppress that cheatgrass for 4 years or more. And while that happens, the perennial grasses then can get up and ahead of that cheatgrass, and hopefully there'll be less cheatgrass in the future, because that's the main fire risk we're dealing with there on the east side. So here's a little bit more on that as far as, and I'm running out of time. Are we at a hard stop at 12, Eva?
No, since this will be recorded, we can keep on going. And
all right, I should go maybe another 5 minutes or so. And so basically, this is a huge project that we got done this year as a test. This was funded through BLM and Department of Natural Resources as basically a fire prevention test. And so what we were able to do is treat an average of a 20-foot wide band along all of these roads to take out the cheat grass or the downy brome, and allow those perennial grasses that are in there to increase in population. And then we'll see, we're going to be watching this really closely, but this was 250 miles and about 800 acres of treatment we were able to get out this last fall on that site. So here's what you're looking at. This is coming up the hill. So coming up from Vantage on the Columbia River to ryegrass, the rest area at the top there, is some of the worst fire risk that we have. This burns on a regular basis, and a lot of it has to do with overheated vehicles coming up the hill, and some of it has to do with metal parts, a lot of trailers dragging chains, and those sparks eventually just take one, and that whole landscape is up in flames. So here's the east side of the river that was treated a lot flatter out that way, but really this is also at risk there. That is all that lighter colored grass is downy brome. And what happens when it catches from the edge, it just goes as fast as the wind. And so and then the thing that happens after this is the cheatgrass will come right back after a fire like this, and the perennial grasses are slower to come back, and the sage and bitterbrush and all the native shrubs. And so what you end up with is a repeating system that the more it burns, the more prone to fire in the future. All right, so coming back to the west side and looking at what we're doing with some of the fish passage projects. This is up around Shelton on Highway 101, Coffee Creek, where we restored that, replaced the culvert, and planted about 10 acres. That planting really takes about 10 to 12 years of careful babysitting to keep it going in the right direction, keep all the blackberries and unwanted trees out of the shrub areas, and really allow that to fill in and form a solid cover. And we're getting 3 years of plant establishment from the contract, and then gets back to maintenance. There's a gap there. And what happens is, if we don't get out there with maintenance forces, that becomes a lost investment, because the site gets overgrown with invasives. Japanese knotweed, blackberry, Scotch broom, the butterfly bush is an increasing just nuisance as far as how fast it's able to spread in a setting like this. All right. So one other thing I'll mention and then wrap up is this is a site down south of Olympia. This is the Scatter Creek rest area. And we got special funding this last year to demonstrate the potential in roadsides in terms of pollinator habitat and carbon sequestration. So we're doing some meadows here to restore the native South Puget Sound prairie ecosystem, and looking at how the best to amend the soil and work with the soil, and then what kind of seeding methods are best. And so we've got test plots there. We're using some biochar. That's another really interesting as far as climate and being able to use carbon and keep it from going out into the atmosphere. Anyway, biochar, compost, and really native seeds, not just native in terms of species, but native ecotypes, and then try to replicate that throughout about 4 miles of corridor on I-5 there. So I was out this morning. We're planning this area. We just flagging all the trees that are going in here, 250 trees and another 500 trees down that 4-mile stretch of I-5. So here's what it looks like. That's the rest area. Here's how we basically did weed control and then scraped the site and then amended those plots with various treatments of compost, biochar, and some other additives that we're looking at to help kind of kickstart the seeding. Hydroseeded it, and then we put out some fences, and we're going to be putting out some panels. So this is really getting the public engaged, getting the public educated about this. We're going to talk on the panels about pollinators, carbon. There's pocket gophers on this site, which is a threatened species in the South Puget Sound prairies. And then really, this will be a place a lot of people use this rest area. So we'll get a lot of eyes on it. And really, hopefully, that's really what it's going to take is this, in this case, Washington State, or even travelers from out of state. But like I said, I think the scale of attack is really statewide in this case. But you can do this at a watershed scale. You can do it at a neighborhood scale, a city scale. And really just, we need more of this kind of stuff going on to get the public engaged in like citizen science and taking an interest in it. And here's the native oaks that we're planting. So we've got a whole bunch of these. We're going to lay them out. I'm kind of looking forward to this. We get to hike that whole site and lay out the trees. I get to help with that. So we're going to do that with it. The guys are out there right now doing the rest area, but we're going to go down the highway and do that here in the next week or so. And this is some of the trees that were planted just, I think these are about 8-year-old Gary oaks. There's what the site's looking like. So the big empty areas like that with the just grass will now be grass and oaks. And camas. Camas is really happy out there. There's a lot of it. And this is a cultural plant. This is Native Americans used to maintain these South Puget Sound prairies so that they could basically harvest the camas, and it's a great food source. And you can see a little bit of Scotch broom in there. We've been working on the Scotch broom on this site for 15 years now, trying to get rid of it. But if you don't know, Scotch broom is the superpower is its seeds they just basically will sit there until the conditions are right, and they can go like 50 or 60 years and still germinate. So Scotch broom is here to stay. And yeah, so that's what I got. I only went 5 minutes over. Or maybe I didn't because you went long, Eva.
Yes, thank you so much, Ray. Thank you for bearing with that timing snafu. If anyone has questions for Ray, please put them in the chat. Even if we're not able to get to them, we'll be sure that we can respond to them post facto. And so, Ray, if you do need to go.
No, I can hang out as long as everybody else is good. Thanks for all the applause.
so much. That's so neat to see. I also just love that kind of grows on the roadside. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
It takes 6 years from a seed though to start forming a bulb, and so the plant, it takes a while for that to get going.
Okay. So it does look like we have a couple different questions. First is, what kind of help do you need from the private sector?
At the state scale here for the roadsides, is that the question?
I think that's to you. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I think the best thing is talk to your representatives, your state representatives, and let them know the problem we have. Because we can't get to this, it's really not safe. A lot of the roadsides, it's not a good place to have volunteers out there, but we do have Adopt a Highway, and we do have some good examples of Adopt a Highway groups taking sections on and doing their own restoration locally. And there are places that are safe to do that. So that's what I would say is, if you have a spot that you know of that you think might be safe and you could make a difference. One great example is Bainbridge Island, Highway 305 going across there. We had a group for a while, quite a while, of locals there that were going out with weed wrenches and pulling Scotch broom along that stretch. So there are places like that where it makes sense. You can volunteer to pick up litter too. That always helps. So we have Adopt a Highway for litter control. But that's what I would say. And if you do have a really good idea, feel free to give me a call. I would happy to hook you up if I can.
Thanks. And everyone, if you do need to log out, no worries. We'll send the full recording with this Q&A portion out to everyone. Right, it looks like we have a question that I'm interested in as well. How much does competitive seeding native forb and graminoids factor into your roadside treatment plans?
Yeah, I think it doesn't happen with maintenance enough. If we had more money, we could do that kind of thing with maintenance. It mainly happens when we go in and rework the road or rebuild the system. And then it's a flawed process because we're relying on contractors for the first 3 years. And a lot of times those are subcontractors and they're not out there, so they miss things. So even after 3 years of that kind of establishment for the natives, and we are always looking at putting natives back when we take out or redo any kind of roadside. That's a huge part of our policy is to try to always use native plants. You'll see a lot of examples where that didn't happen, especially in the past. I mean, we used to plant English ivy, for Pete's sake. That's crazy. I think, and when I started working for DOT, we were still planting English ivy, and that was a huge mistake. So there's a lot of issues like that where we've learned, and that's that roadside policy document that I mentioned. We were really able to make sure that we didn't do that, and yet things slip through. But anyway, that's what I would say to that is we really try, and we need a better system. But I think this kind of a demonstration, like we're looking at here, down and using basically a roadside lab, creating that kind of an approach. So that's in any kind of feedback. If you guys just legislature is one thing, but anything, spread the word. I mean, just tell everybody that how important it is that that we start doing a better job taking care of our state roadsides.
There's a quick question: which pre-emergent you were using for cheatgrass in Eastern Washington?
Yeah, that's Indaziflam, which is it's a product called Esplanade, or the rangeland label is Rejuvra, and that one it's newer, it's really expensive, but that's the main backbone of that. We're also using a couple other softer pre-emergents, rimsulfuron and sulfametron, and then using another sort of a broadleaf like aminopyrrolid, so Milestone, as well, to address some of those harder to control weeds like Russian thistle.
Maybe just the final question. I'll combine a couple. Is climate change impacting or influencing which species you're using for restoration, and what else might be influencing those choices as well, like maybe pollinator
Yeah.
sources?
Yeah, and we're going to have a board on this at the rest area, but one of the species that we're looking at as a sort of a migration species is redwood. So we're planting a few, not a ton of them, but we're going to throw in some coast redwood and some giant sequoia in the rest area renovation, and talk about climate migration and the fact that that species, or those redwood species in particular, are really good at carbon and adapt, and they'll be more comfortable living in the Northwest than they have in the past. And I remember when I first started noticing those trees, and when it was colder in the winters here, we would see a lot of damage to the tops of those, especially the coast redwoods. But they grow up in the mountains and the Sierras, so I would think they'd be fine here. Anyway, that's a good example. And then really just preserving like the oak species. Those are some of the most hardy and fire resistant species that can grow in this kind of a system. So things like that. Those are the best examples I can think of.
There's multiple questions on whether or not that these restoration plantings might be influencing roadkill and attracting species that then become roadkill.
Right. Yeah, and there's a lot of research on that as far as vehicle insect collisions, especially, but that's always a factor. And you'll see, even in this slide, you can see that inslope to the highway is maintained differently than the back slope and the rest of the right of way. And so maintaining that, and that's just making sure that that isn't a desirable forage for pollinators or wildlife. That's really the only solution there. And then if you remember this cross section I had, our land composition is really a third of the roadside is that highly managed operational zone, and 2/3 of it is in the rest of that. And so there's more land in the outside the operational zone that we could be working on, but we aren't funded to take care of that right now unless it's a special project like this one. So we're pretty much letting it go. That's why you see so much blackberry and Scotch broom on so many of our roadsides, because we aren't funded to control those species.
Well, this has been incredibly interesting. Thank you so much, Ray, and thank you for staying after as well.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah, I'm gonna close it all off now, but thank you everyone for being here and for sticking around till the end, those of you.